The sound of drums echoed through the streets long before the people saw the procession. It was still early, the kind of morning where the sun had only just begun to burn off the haze drifting above Jerusalem's rooftops. Vendors paused mid-setup. Children ran toward the noise. Soldiers straightened as they stood at the city gates, watching a column of Levites come into view, moving in slow, deliberate steps. Every hand gripped the poles that carried the Ark of the Covenant, and even at a distance the tension in their arms was visible. No one wanted to be the one whose foot slipped. No one wanted to test the stories of what happened when the sacred object was mishandled. Behind the Ark, King David moved with a pace that didn't match the stiff control of the guards or the measured steps of the priests. He wore a simple linen ephod instead of royal robes. Sweat had already begun to gather at his temples, but he didn't seem to notice. He shouted praise above the music, clapping in rhythm with the cymbals, his movements loose and unrestrained. Every few steps he broke into a run, circling the procession, before dropping back into place. The sight of it drew laughter from some in the crowd and stunned silence from others. A king didn't usually behave this way, not in public, not in front of foreign visitors, not in front of servants who watched every detail and carried stories back into the city's narrow alleys. From a high window in the palace, Michal saw it all. She had risen early when she heard the drums and stepped to the balcony out of habit, expecting to watch the procession like any member of the royal household. But when she saw David dancing and shouting among the commoners, something hardened in her expression. She had been raised in the courts of Saul, where every movement was controlled, every ceremony polished to reflect authority. Her father had believed royalty must be distant, its dignity protected at all costs. Now she watched David, her husband, perform with what she saw as reckless abandon, exposing himself emotionally to a crowd that would never understand the weight of the crown he carried. The procession entered the city with a roar of celebration. The ark moved through the gates, its surface gleaming beneath the sun. The Levites trembled as they passed through crowds pressing so close that soldiers had to push people back with the flats of their hands. David continued to dance, his face lit with a joy that erased the years he had spent fighting wars, hiding in caves, and clawing his way to the throne. For him, the moment meant restoration. It meant finally bringing the nation's most sacred symbol into the capital he had built with so much blood and effort. To the crowd, it felt like history unfolding beneath their feet. When the ark reached the tent prepared for it, David offered sacrifices and blessed the people. Thick smoke curled upward from the altar, carrying the smell of burning fat into the hot air lines formed as David handed out food with his own hands. Loaves of bread, cuts of meat, cakes of raisins. Children clung to their parents as they pushed forward, eager to receive something from the king. Musicians played until their fingers ached. Dancers spun in circles, their clothing stained with dust. The celebration stretched into the afternoon, long enough that birds circled overhead and shadows lengthened across the hills. Only when the sun had dropped behind the western ridge did David finally return to the palace. His clothing was damp with sweat. He smelled of smoke and dust and the thousands of people who had pressed close to him throughout the day, but he walked with the relaxed stride of a man at peace. The ark was home. The city was united. The day felt like a turning point in a reign that had rarely given him rest. As he stepped inside the entrance hall, Michal appeared before him. She didn't wait for him to speak. Her words came quickly, sharply, slicing through the warm haze of celebration he carried home with him. She told him he had disgraced himself, using a tone that made servants nearby stiffen. She said he had acted beneath the dignity of his position, exposing himself before slave girls and city dwellers who would mock him later. She accused him of seeking attention, behaving like a fool hungry for applause. Her voice never broke, never wavered. Every word hit its mark with the precision of someone who believed she was defending the throne itself. David stopped. The smile faded from his face, and the weight of her contempt settled heavily between them. He answered her without raising his voice, but the intensity in his tone made the servants drift quietly away. He said he had danced for the Lord, not for the approval of anyone watching. He reminded her that God had chosen him, an insignificant shepherd, over her father, her brothers, and the entire household of Saul. He told her that if humility was required, he would go even lower, stripping away whatever dignity he needed to honor the one who had lifted him so high. And he added, with cold finality, that the very women she mentioned would respect him more than she ever had. The argument ended abruptly. Michal turned away. David walked past her without another word, but something deeper snapped in the silence that followed. Servants whispered in the days after, noting how Michal avoided the festivities, how she paced her chambers in the evenings and stood at her window long after the torches were extinguished in the courtyards below, how her laughter, once occasional but genuine, disappeared entirely. The palace moved on. She didn't. Scripture records the consequence with chilling brevity. Michal, daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death. The moment of scorn she unleashed in the entrance hall carried a punishment that marked her life forever. One day she was a queen standing in a palace full of potential. The next, her womb closed, sealed by judgment so final that no ritual, no prayer, no reconciliation could undo it. Seasons changed. Wars came and went. David's family grew with sons and daughters who played in the palace corridors. Feast days filled the household with laughter, candlelight, and the sound of footsteps racing across polished floors. But Michal's chambers remained quiet. When the women of the household announced pregnancies, joy swelled in the palace, everywhere except behind her door. She offered congratulations, polite and distant, before retreating into silence. Servants avoided discussing children in her presence. Midwives bowed softly when passing her, aware of the ache she carried but never acknowledged. The years dulled the memory of her confrontation with David, but the consequences lingered until her final breath. She faded from the palace narrative, her name mentioned less and less as new heirs entered the world. By the time she died, some had almost forgotten she once danced with David in their youth, long before crowns, betrayals, and burdens reshaped their lives. Others remembered only the moment she stood at the palace window and saw her husband through eyes clouded by pride. Her story closes with a silence as heavy as the punishment itself, a queen whose lineage ended in a single act of disdain, whose womb never opened because judgment had already sealed it. Thank you for listening to Divine Crime. Subscribe for more true stories from the most dangerous book ever written.